Ladies and gentlemen, tonight has multiple aspects of significance to me personally. August 9th in the year of our Lord 2020 is both my 36th birthday and the date which marks having lived 50% of my life here in the United States and 50% in the place of my birth, the United Kingdom. It also marks facing off against the very first atheist who came after me personally since I started engaging in YouTube apologetics when he supposedly debunked one of my videos. Now, in that light, let this day stand as a line of demarcation for me and to all those who meet me in the future, whether it be in person or in the digital ring of debate in which we are currently engaged. From henceforth, there will be no quarter given to the enemies of our Creator, nor those who refuse to look beyond the pathetic talking points spewed by my opponent and those like him. The verbal weapons you wield are broken. Your arguments are juvenile and lacking in substance. The more I engage with atheists, the more I realize you are mental children desperate to avoid the obvious. That the dogma of naturalism and its foundation of Darwinian evolution is nothing but a cloud of smoke which is decimated by the wind of rational thought and logical analysis. We are told that evolution is a settled and proven science, yet its very foundation is based upon the assumption that information can come from nothing. If this is so, why then does all modern science prove beyond doubt that life cannot reproduce without the genetic code housed in our DNA? In any other context, a person would be considered insane to insist that a language of any kind, spoken or written, could form without consciousness and intellect being required. I ask you, would any rational person argue the numerous languages used for the software and design of hardware required for this debate? Could they possibly somehow spring into existence by chance? Without intelligence and logic, can any of these concepts be devised? I would say no, but I shall let the words of my opponent address this question. I leave the determination of his rationality to you, the audience. This brings me to what my next video will explain in much more detail, and that is the genetic code, and more importantly, the information it contains. Atheists desperately attempt to avoid the premise that it actually contains real information and is not just purely deterministic chemical reactions.
I mean, it is just chemical reactions. Like I said at the beginning of this, DNA can be interpreted as a code, but that does not make it inherently a code. We can determine certain sequences, and we can know the effect of those sequences on the rest of the organism, or on certain biomechanical operations or chemical interactions within an organism. Like, we can determine those things. Just because we can determine sequences in DNA does not mean that it inherently contains code, though.
DNA it's an identical process to computer codes. And it's very interesting that, you know, computer ideas about computers developed early in the 20th century, and, you know, Claude Shannon comes along in 1948.
But it is not a code, it's a chemical. It's deoxyribonucleic acid. It's an acid. I don't understand why you think it's a code. DNA is no more of a code than Diet Coke and regular Coke.
There needs to be no question that communication theory applies to biology. Okay? All of these concepts can be applied to DNA.
Is that debated anywhere?
Only among people who are ignorant, frankly.
Okay.
Okay? People in the know do not debate this fact.
But not in this credible scientific community. This is well understood.
There is no credible scientific argument to try to say that applying communication theory to biology is somehow inappropriate.
Yeah.
There's hundreds of scientific papers that go very deep into the subject, and so, no, there's...
And again, the only people that have ever mentioned this or ever said this or ever expect this are creationists, just like you.
I'm talking at the moment with Perry Marshall and Kevin Ham. Perry Marshall is from Chicago in the United States, and Kevin Ham is from Vancouver in Canada, and we have just taken part in the United Kingdom launch of a huge prize to be won by anybody who can produce the genetic code or a genetic code via natural process generating it itself. Perry, have I got that right, first of all?
That's right. Any code, any encoding, message decoding system that can come out of an emergent property from chemicals to code would qualify.
Yes.
And I think it's one of the most fundamental questions in all of science. And it just hasn't gotten the attention that it deserves.
That's right, it hasn't, and I think that's partly why we've been highlighting it in the meeting that we've just had here at the Royal Society in London. You can't get much more prestigious than that, can you?
No, it's
by the way,
it's
yes.
delightful.
Yes. Now, question perhaps also to Kevin: does it really need to be 10 million? You know, I'm a scientist. To me, that's a huge sum of money.
But it is not a code, it's a chemical. It's deoxyribonucleic acid. It's an acid. I don't understand why you think it's a code. DNA is no more of a code than Diet Coke and regular Coke.
Damn, dude, there's 10 million on the line for this one. I guess you just need to fly over to Oxford, go meet up with the Royal Society, and tell them how they've been completely duped on this entire premise of the genetic code actually being a real code, and that they don't need to be remotely associated with it because it could completely decimate their credibility as academics. In the information age we currently enjoy, to me it's a completely implausible concept to conclude that HTML, CSS, JavaScript, PHP, WordPress, apps, or any of the other aspects of technology that utilize software, that they could possibly come into existence without programmers and designers being required.
I agree, that would be crazy to assert, but luckily that's not what we're asserting. That's not what anybody's asserting here. It's only you that's claiming that evolution would entail this. So you're basically building a straw man argument against people that already accept evolution and are misrepresenting their arguments for evolution. You see, the biggest difference here is that we have natural explanations for like why DNA looks the way that it does, why it operates the way that it does, and why the diversity of life that we have here on Earth exists. We have natural explanations for why these things happen. We don't have explanation for why like PHP exists, other than somebody designed it. So what you're really doing here is you're comparing bananas to horses here.
Now, while it continues to fascinate me that people such as Godless Engineer continue to make these same assertions, I'm just going to pull up a few papers real quick and scroll through them on how the genetic code, it's a universal enigma from Eugene Koonin. I mean, he's a very high level, actually an atheist, but he admits that there's a code and it's a major conundrum for origin of life. We've got things like dual syntax. I'm pretty sure that syntax is a component of coding and programming. Go figure. Apparently that doesn't exist, but here's evidence that it does. And then here we can really get into some fun stuff where not only is the genetic code have its own programming logic, translational pausing is a subset syntax and code base, which enables a dual control of, from a timing perspective, we're talking about 3D printing logic rules that are executed through the ribosome through the dual syntax in the genetic code that supposedly isn't a code, even though it houses all sorts of controls, including space and time, which I think is just fascinating. And then you go over into, here's another paper on how computational theory applies to genetics. I mean, you can just go on and on and on with all these different pieces, and you get into information. And here's some interesting stuff about prescriptive information and formal information and how it requires forethought and logic in order for the ciphers and the algorithms to be executed. But according to my opponent, none of this stuff actually exists. There's just no logical, plausible, and probable conclusion you can reach that says binary code will magically transform into syntax, semantics, pragmatics, and all the other if, then, and else logic rules that are required for any type of programming to actually work.
And again, the only people that have ever mentioned this or ever said this or ever expect this are creationists, just like you.
Now, before I go into my formal arguments against neo-Darwinism and modern synthesis, I want you all as the audience to just observe one of the many nanomachine component processes is required for life to exist.
What you are about to see is DNA's most extraordinary secret: how a simple code is turned into flesh and blood. It begins with a bundle of factors assembling at the start of a gene. A gene is simply a length of DNA instructions stretching away to the left. The assembled factors trigger the first phase of the process, reading off the information that will be needed to make the protein. Everything is ready to roll. 3, 2, 1, go. The blue molecule racing along the DNA is reading the gene. It's unzipping the double helix and copying one of the 2 strands. The yellow chain snaking out of the top is a copy of the genetic message, and it's made of a close chemical cousin of DNA called RNA. The building blocks to make the RNA enter through an intake hole. They are matched to the DNA, letter by letter, to copy the A's, C's, T's, and G's of the gene. The only difference is that in the RNA copy, the letter T is replaced with a closely related building block known as U. You are watching this process called transcription in real time. It's happening right now in almost every cell in your body.
Obviously, this debate will go in many directions, but here are 5 positions which challenge the premise of undirected evolution through natural selection being a logical, plausible, or probable reason for our existence. First, adaptation of existing functions to account for environmental condition variance is primarily executed through epigenetic factors which do not result in new core functions. This is a known fact, and the epigenome is a fundamental element which has shaken the entire premise of evolution to its core. Not only are these adaptations the result of variable gene expression caused by epigenetics, they are not the result of mutations. Rather, are controlled modifications executed through read, write, and erase nanomachines. Second, it is my position that macroevolution is not proven by speciation, nor by variance within species. While Darwinists attempt to explain this with very slow changes over time, it is now known that literally thousands of genes and gene regulatory networks working in synchronicity are required for new body plans to exist. Not only must they work in unison, it has been shown extremely minor modifications are fatal in embryo development. While I do not discount that variance can occur on a contained level, it is my strong contingency that these are the result of reorganization and adaptation of existing data and functional capacity, not the creation of new information or function solely through random mutation and natural selection. Third, the variation of transcription factors in gene regulatory networks results in a significant difference in gene expression. To date, the most studied of these are in relation to cognitive function, and show a 9 to 23% of variation between chimps and humans. It has also been shown these differences must work in unison, and any degradation of this, even to the level of point mutation, results in dynamic impairment or death. Not only does this showcase the extreme importance of gene regulation, it also decimates the relevance of similar coding genes in relation to final outcome. Moreover, the significant differences in non-coding regions of the genome become apparent for things ranging from introns, retrotransposons, enhancers, and promoters, to name a few, all of which have been dismissed by those against intelligent design. However, the discoveries made in the past decade have made their relevance unavoidable. Fourth, it has now become apparent through structural biology that not only is the prescriptive information housed in the genetic code required, it must also be geographically coordinated through dynamic real-time folding to enable full gene expression. This applies to interchromosomal data transfer, which not only forces acceptance of physical gene locations being vital, it also decimates the relevance of similar sequences existing in another organism, but being housed in a completely different physical location. Not only does this make sequence similarities irrelevant in relation to undirected natural selection, it actually lends credence to intelligent design. Fifth, the prescriptive information in our genetic code uses arbitrary values, the meaning of which is unknown without a translation mechanism. This semantic meaning is immaterial, and in no other context could it be interpreted without the prior actions of an intelligent agent. It is an unavoidable reality that our genetic code is a four-dimensional programming codebase unlike anything humans have ever conceived. When all of this is viewed through the now known reality that not only must the information exist, it must also be in a specific physical location in the genome. To conclude that foreknowledge of the desired outcome is not required for life to exist, requires those who dismiss intelligent design to suspend all rational thought. Therefore, its initial creation by undirected physical process, without the action of an intelligent agent, is not only neither logical, plausible, or probable, but impossible. In closing, as you consider these arguments and expansion of them throughout the debate, ask yourself this question: whose position is more rational? Is it those who conclude it is more logical, plausible, and probable that these things could not occur by chance? Or those who argue, no matter how counterintuitive it is, you must believe this could all happen without a designer being required?
But it is not a code, it's a chemical. It's deoxyribonucleic acid.
Yes, information comes from the mind. Now, DNA isn't literal information. It's metaphorical information. It kind of acts like information sometimes. But it's not information. It's a chain of molecules. That's all it is. He then says intelligence is the only known cause of information. Sure, but biological information? That word is used as a metaphor because, like I said, it's just a string of molecules. That's it.
Hey, Chatty Spike, I'll just call you Chatty. There are 2 points you made that I want to address. One, you said that information comes from a mind, and I agree with this. In fact, you even acknowledge that intelligence is the only known cause of information. And your second point you made was that DNA is not actually information. When people say that, they just mean it metaphorically, and so it's not really information. So in this video, I want to show you that you're wrong about that. DNA is information. And if DNA is information, as you've already acknowledged, the only explanation for the origin of information would be intelligence.
DNAs are just really, really long molecules. It's not information any more than sodium hydroxide is. If DNA is information, everything is information.
In one sense, Chatty, you are right. DNA is just chemicals, just like sodium hydroxide or any other chemical. It's just a chemical. So, what's the difference? I'm glad you asked. The difference is in the way the chemicals are arranged. One definition of design is the purposeful arrangement of parts. Take a look at this page here. This page here contains information, but it is just chemicals, right? I mean, it's only ink on paper, so what makes it information? Well, the information isn't in the ink itself. If you study the ink, if you study the paper and how they interact together, you will never be able to detect or find this information. The information transcends the ink and paper, and the information is not explained by the molecular structure of ink. Because the ink on this paper is placed in a certain way to convey a meaning, the only way we can explain this arrangement is by positing some intelligent mind behind it. We have to trace it back to a mind. We cannot explain this information by reference to the laws of nature or to the properties of the chemicals involved here. We have to explain it by positing some intelligent mind behind it. And notice that when we say this was intelligently designed, this isn't an argument from ignorance. This paper right here is the evidence. This is evidence of intelligent design.
The leading theory is that DNA came from RNA. Now, where did the RNA come from? From nucleotides that can assemble in the right conditions. Where do these nucleotides come from? Chemical reactions, again in the right conditions.
So here you seem to imply that the information is in the substance itself, or in the nucleotides themselves, but they're not. It's a lot like the information on this page. The information is not in the ink. And same thing with DNA. The information is not in the nucleotides. The information is conveyed by the way the nucleotides are arranged and how they code for life or functions. Just like the information here is conveyed not in the ink, but in the way the ink is arranged on the paper. So just like the ink on paper, we have to explain its origin by reference to a mind that transcends it and that created it. And same with DNA. The only way to explain that arrangement of nucleotides is to posit some intelligent mind behind it. Since you claimed that DNA was not information, I figured I'd ask you what your definition of information is.
Yes, I have a personal definition of information that I just hold dear to me.
So here you're being sarcastic, but I think it's actually true. Either that or you don't know what DNA is. And I could give you several quotes from creation scientists, but instead I'll give you some quotes from some very popular evolutionists themselves who talk about DNA and the information in it.
Genes are information. They are coded information. It even looks like computer information. I mean, a chromosome is a great long computer tape. Digital code, it's not binary, it's quaternary, but apart from that, it's just the same as computer tape. Biology has turned into computer science.
Richard Dawkins also says something similar in his latest book, The Greatest Show on Earth. And he says here on page 405, he says, the difference between life and non-life is a matter not of substance, but of information. Living things contain prodigious amounts of information. Most of the information is digitally coded in DNA. And that's kind of what I've been saying with my analogy to ink and paper, right? The difference between this and some page with random ink thrown on it is not a matter of substance, but it's a matter of information. If you prefer, I have a quote here from the physicist Paul Davies. Here's what he says. He calls the living cell an information processing and replicating system of astonishing complexity. He goes on to say, DNA is not a special life-giving molecule, but a genetic database that transmits its information using mathematical code. This leaves us with a curious conundrum. How did nature fabricate the world's first digital information processor, the original living cell, from the blind chaos of blundering molecules? How did molecular hardware get to write its own software? You may have heard of Anthony Flew, the famous atheist philosopher, who he used to debate Christians and theists on the existence of God and stuff like that. And in 2004, I think it was, he became a theist. And one of the reasons he cited was because of intelligent design. In fact, here's one of his quotes. It now seems to me that the findings of more than 50 years of DNA research have provided materials for a new and enormously powerful argument to design. And that is one of the reasons why this famous atheist philosopher, who published peer-reviewed papers defending atheism and went around debating theists and Christians, later came to write this book, There Is a God, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. You should read this book, by the way. It's a good book.
Yes, there are some things we don't know yet. But I'm just curious, once forgiven, now free. Since there's something we don't really know right now, since there's something that we haven't quite figured out yet about the origin of life, what do you think we should do about that?
That's a good question. I think we should just give up and say God did it. No, that's a joke, by the way. I don't mean that. All right, I think we should follow the evidence where it leads. That's what Anthony Flew said he was doing when he became a theist. He said it was just a matter of following the evidence where it leads. Now, obviously, I wasn't there, and neither were you, when life first originated on Earth. So we can't really know in an empirical way. But if life contains information, and, as you put it...
Yes, information comes from the mind.
Then I say, so be it. You might not like it, it might have implications that you don't like, but that's just tough. Chatty as Spike, let's not artificially restrict ourselves and claim that only material causes are allowed. That's what Richard Lewontin did. He says, we have an a priori commitment to materialism, and this materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Don't be closed-minded like this guy. If you follow the evidence where it leads, if life contains information and the only known cause of information is intelligence, then that means that intelligent design is the best, causally adequate explanation for the origin of life. And if that's where the evidence goes, so be it.
Yes, information comes from the mind.
Genes are information.
Yes, information comes from the mind.
Atheism makes the case that nature created all things, where theism states it's intellectually designed. What about storms? What category would that go under? Ah, absolutely. What about music? Yep, intelligent design. Well played, Beethoven. How about stalagmites? Definitely nature created some of the most beautiful caverns created by nature. Maps? Ah, that's easy. Chicago, Chicago. Okay, snowflakes? A little trickier. Yep, nature created, and no two are alike.
Ah.
Microsoft? Intelligent design? Possibly. Ah, actually, definitely intelligent design.
So, you may ask, what are you getting at, Bill?
What are you talking about, you wingnut?
Well, simply this. What do storms, stalagmites, and snowflakes have in common?
Blah, blah, blah.
The answer is this. Patterns. Yeah, they're all patterns. Now, these three items represent many other things, obviously, but for right now, we're just going to let them represent the items that fit under the category of patterns. As opposed to what? Well, as opposed to designs. That's where music, Microsoft, and maps come into play. As we look at these two categories of patterns and designs, we're going to note that there are some differences that are definitely worth stating. Such as, number one, not all patterns are designed, but all designs are patterns. In terms of patterns, there is never an exact copy.
That's okay.
Patterns are created through matter and energy, as opposed to designs, which are created through matter and energy, and will. And that's going to be significantly important as we proceed.
I can't believe I let you talk me into this.
Let's take a look at patterns versus designs. More specifically, designs. They are always represented symbolically. So there's always a symbolic representation that goes along with the reality. Let's take a look at music. There is the sheet music, the notes, the language that corresponds. Now, this is the symbolic representation of the reality of music. Right? There's a mental process. Somebody must write the music.
I write the song.
Ooh, enough of that. I almost lost my sanctification on that one. All right, there's also a symbolic representation of what we see in what we hear, which gives us the end reality of music itself. All right, now, is this Chicago? No. It's a symbolic representation of Chicago. See, that's the real deal. Is this Microsoft? No. It's a symbolic representation of the reality. This is the reality. So let me ask this question of fellow Christians as well as atheists who follow the religion of evolution. Is it possible to represent something symbolically without the use of language? The answer is absolutely not. Language, by sheer definition, is the symbolic representation of something else. Atheists and theists both believe information is based on language, correct? Correct. Did you know that all information is based on language?
That's pretty much it.
Theists have no problem with this. However, an atheist or a follower of evolution struggles with this concept of all information being based on language.
You got it!
Because language implies a thought process.
Unbelievable!
Is it wrong to say that smoke signals were informational and communicated through a language?
What do you think?
Or what about a telegraph? Back in the day, it was used to communicate information, send messages. It was a language. The language it used to communicate this information through a language was called Morse code. Now, is Morse code any different than the DNA code? or even smoke signals for that matter.
Seriously?
Genetic code Nobel Prize recipients Francis Crick and James Watson acknowledged themselves that the DNA strand is a code or language. So if you're an atheist and you're thinking to yourself, DNA isn't a code, it's just a simple molecule. All they've got to say, my friend, oh, is so very wrong and need to be educated just a little bit more, okay?
How dare you?
Now, specifically in terms of the DNA code, we must realize that all languages have 4 elements: alphabet, grammar, meaning, and intent.
Yes, indeed.
Now, that's exactly what you find in the DNA double helix. You have alphabet, grammar, meaning, and intent. DNA code is not, well, it's kind of like a language. It is a language. You know, it's not like when your son or daughter, your daughter comes and says, well, yeah, I kind of like this boy. Kind of, you know, or your son says, yeah, this girl's kind of cute, you know. It's more like, you know, well, I'm kind of pregnant.
Who is this?
You know, either you are or you aren't, okay? And in this case, DNA is a language. And if by chance you're a scientifically geeky person and you want to memorize the 4 components, adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine, if you want to remember that, I got something for you.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, that's right, sisters. So just realize this. The 4 letters, A, C, T, and G, it's an act of God.
Unbelievable!
So in closing, which is completely meaningless behind a pulpit or a microphone, keep in mind, ideas always precede implementation, always, no exceptions. All languages come from a mind, no exceptions. There are no languages that do not come from a mind. So we know that DNA was designed, and a mind designed DNA, therefore God exists.
You've been acting really weird lately.
Now, if there's somebody who would like to disprove this, just simply show a language that did not originate from a mind.
We need to have a serious talk!
For you thinking people out there, I would like to see more information on this. This comes from a gentleman named Perry Marshall, who has a very interesting website. And I'm going to post it up here for you, and I'm going to have a link in the description field. I encourage you to go take a look and be better off for it.